Hello and welcome to episode 66 of the Chills at Will podcast. It's a pleasure to be joined today by Gabrielle Bates. Gabrielle Bates is a writer and visual artist originally from Birmingham, Alabama. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, Poetry Magazine, Virginia Quarterly Review, New England Review, Gulf Coast, Mississippi Review, Black Warrior Review, and the Best of the Net Anthology, and BAX, BAX, Best American Experimental Writing, and her poetry comics have been featured internationally in a variety of exhibitions, festivals, and conferences. Formerly the managing editor of the Seattle Review and a contributing editor for Poetry Northwest, Gabrielle currently serves as a social media manager of Open Books, a poem emporium, a contributing editor for Bull City Press, and a University of Washington teaching fellow. She also volunteers as a poetry mentor through the Adroit Teen Mentorship Program and teaches occasionally as a spotlight author through Seattle's Writers in the Schools. With Luther Hughes and Duje Tahat, she co-hosts the podcast, The Poet Salon. Gabrielle, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to meet you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
The bio, how did I do? Is there anything you'd like to add or subtract or expound upon?
You did wonderfully. One thing I could add, it's pretty exciting. It was just announced today
Mm.
that the manuscript of my first poetry collection, Judas Goat, was a finalist for the inaugural Bergman Prize, which was judged by Louise Glick, who's
Oh.
a poetry hero of mine, recently won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So it didn't win, it's not going to be published, but I'm encouraged by the fact that it was a finalist. So we can add that to my bio
Oh,
as of today.
congratulations. I've heard of the Nobel Prize. It's kind of a big deal. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, some people have heard of it.
Yeah, and also the New Yorker is a huge deal. Some people may have heard of it who are listening. Congrats on that. As you said, it went live today. Your poem we're going to discuss a little bit later. What does that feel like in the moment? Like to go online, I'm sure you're getting all kinds of great feedback to have your work in the New Yorker. How does that feel?
Yeah, it definitely takes it to a next level to know that a poem might be in front of the eyes of like a million people. Usually, when you
Yes.
publish a poem, it's like, oh, maybe if a couple people might stumble upon it on the internet
Hmm.
or something. But to know it's appearing in a periodical that just tons of people have in their dentist's office, on their
Hmm.
bedside table, it's terrifying, and it's super exciting,
Right.
and it's all the things at the same
Hmm.
time. And I always say there's something about that font, like seeing a title that you wrote in
Hmm.
that New Yorker font.
Yes.
It's really surreal to me.
Oh man.
It's great, it's scary, it's awesome, it's all the things.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, I think so many people could recognize just that singular font, like that's a New Yorker. Oh man, so cool. Congrats. I want to talk a little bit about growing up and kind of where you come from as far as your relationship with language and such. Growing up in Alabama, which I believe is where you are now, right?
Mhm.
Is this like did you live like the university lifestyle? I think Birmingham's a bit of a college town, if you will, but more so just what was it like growing up in Alabama? What was your relationship with the written word? Did you grow up in a print rich environment? Those type of questions.
Hmm. Yeah, so Birmingham it's a small city. I wasn't really aware of the universities that are here.
Okay.
UAB is huge in like the medical
Mm-hmm.
industry, but it's kind of on its own downtown, and I really wasn't aware of it. Um, I grew up reading a ton. I was reading a lot of the Bible at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I was very into books like C.S. Lewis's
Okay.
series of children's books. I fell in love with Zora Neale Hurston fairly young, and that was a real breakthrough for me in terms of what literature can do,
Mm.
what a real attention to language can do, a real musicality. I didn't know poetry existed necessarily until I was in college. So growing up for me, it was really about novels. I
Okay.
just loved entering these other worlds and trying out these other lives. I am not an orphan, but it's funny how often the main characters in children's novels or young adult novels are orphans. And I had enough difficulty in my family to where I was like really relating hard with like the adventures of these precocious young orphans. And I was reading all the time. You know, I was taking books to restaurants, I was getting them from the public library. My dad, who primarily raised me, would hook me up with these huge stacks of books from this used bookstore, just like whatever classics he could
Yeah.
get for $1, $2, because I went through them so fast. I had grandparents who helped raise me, and when they would pick me up from school in elementary school, we would sometimes go to a bookstore on the way home. I've always loved books, and my first love was definitely novels.
That is so cool, that idea of getting picked up and going right to the bookstore. That's so cool.
Yeah, it was like the toy store for me.
Yeah. I wonder about if you've ever measured or just measuring the effect that the Bible and I mean, talk about C.S. Lewis, I mean, allegory in many ways, right? I wonder if you've
Yeah.
measured what effect that has had on your later reading, your later writing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could ever maybe fully disentangle my writing from that early
Mm,
literary and spiritual influence in my
mhm,
life. It had such a huge role in shaping how I viewed the world, how I viewed language. Um, from an early age, I was searching for symbolism
right.
in what I read and for lessons in what I read. And I applied that to all the books, you know, not just the Bible and not just the books that I knew were allegorical in a
Mhm.
Christian bent. And so I think it added a layer of magic to language for me. Just knowing it might be a portal into a kind of instruction that could have like really dire effects on my life. It
Mm,
raised the stakes
mm,
of books, of novels, of stories. And I think that's still with me. You know, I go to poems open to being instructed by them
mm,
or opened to something that I didn't know about before. Um, and then there's a spiritual element there for me
mhm,
too, still.
mm. Thank you for that. When you talk about Zora Neale Hurston, are we talking Their Eyes Were Watching God? Or are you talking about was that the one in particular that really blew
Yeah,
you away? Uh-huh.
that was the book for me. I've read some of her other books since then as an adult, but early on, I had down the street from me growing up at my dad's house, there were these twins, and they were a few years older than me in the same public school system. And they would gift me the books that they had to read in school.
Mm,
So I would read them several years early. And that was one of the ones I got from them. It was a
uh-huh.
school book that I got to encounter as a younger kid. And I just loved it. I just
Uh-huh.
loved it. I reread it over and over, underlining making my little notes. And by the
Right.
time it was taught in school, I was ready to go. I was like ready to teach that
Uh,
book myself
oh
because I
man.
was such a huge fan.
Oh man.
Um, yeah.
Have you read her piece about, I want to say Eatonville, Florida, where she grew up? I might be getting the town wrong.
Well, it's interesting because I think that town appears in the end of Their Eyes Were Watching God.
Okay.
But is it an essay? Is it a
It's
full book?
it's an essay, and I have no idea if it's one that's commonly taught or known about. It's just, sometimes the things we read are fairly arbitrary, this one that I picked up, but it's one that's really stuck with me because like it's just about her childhood, and she's just like, I didn't just the innocence of not knowing about race even.
Mhm.
She grew up in a place where it's like, yeah, and then when racism hit her, she was like, what? How can you not like me?
Yeah.
You don't know me, like I'm obviously oversimplifying a little bit, but that's the piece that really that stood out. And she
Yeah.
had quite a life too. Did you know a lot about her life? Like she was.
Not a ton. I know that Toni Morrison is credited with really bringing her work
Mm,
into circulation. Like her work could have kind of been lost to the general public if Toni
Yeah.
Morrison hadn't decided to really champion it as an editor.
Yeah, it sounds like, just kind of to sum up, that she didn't really give a dang about what people thought. She was awesome in her own way, just lived her life as she wanted to. What other, the name of the podcast is the Chills at Will podcast, and those pieces that thrill, those pieces that you've memorized, that you think of when you're in life situations. What are some other pieces out, besides the great Zora Neale Hurston, that have really thrilled you throughout the years, whether they're short pieces, texts, poems, novels, etc.?
For poetry, my go-tos when I want chills are Bridget Pegeen Kelly,
Okay.
any of her books. She published 3 in her lifetime: To the Place of Trumpets, The Orchard, and Song. There are poems in all of those books that can raise the hair on my arms
Right.
and give me chills. And another one is Linda Gregg. I have her selected poems called All of It Singing, and there are a lot of poems dog-eared in there that
Yeah.
I can sort of turn to, and I know it's going to work for me. There's something about them. They just are tapping into this magic, kind of dark, eerie, but beautiful world. And now I have to shout out Vivi Francis as well,
Okay.
is a contemporary poet who's still alive, whose work can do that for me.
Awesome. You talk about dog earing those, those books and those poems. I mean, there's nothing like that, right? The used book. Are you a Kindle
Mm-hmm.
reader, or did you come kind of kicking and screaming to Kindle maybe, or electronic reading? Or are you all about give me that hardcover?
I will take my book however I can get
Yeah.
it. I do tend to prefer, if I have the option, a hard copy of a book,
Mhm.
because I am someone who loves to dog ear. I love to make notes in the margins. I am an active reader in that way. I think it started out just because I was an overachieving student, but
Mhm.
it taught me that I remember so much more, and it enriches my second and third readings of books when I can go back and see what I was thinking about or drawn to on
Mm.
earlier reads. I'm not one of those people that's like, the book is a sacred object that
Sure.
I must not mar in any way, which
Yeah.
I have friends who are that way, and I don't judge it, but that's not me.
Yeah.
But I do own a Kindle, and there have been times when I've been traveling or trying to read in a place at night where there isn't a good bedside light, where I'm really grateful for it.
Yeah, no
And it can
doubt.
be good for library books, where if I'm not sure if I want to own it or not, because I'm always out of space on my bookshelves, it
Mm.
can be nice to try it out on the Kindle from the library. And then if I love it and know I want to buy it, I can buy it in hard copy.
There you go. Yeah, storage is a real thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
You talk about the pleasures of the book itself, but have you ever gotten a used book where you see, like, you feel like you get a window into someone's life, where, like, someone writes a nice note, dear so and so, congrats on graduation, you know, you're a hero to me, and then you're like, shoot, somebody like sold that book. Do you know what I'm talking
I
about?
work part-time for a small independent bookstore called Open Books, a poem emporium in
Mm-hmm.
Seattle, and we sell new books and used books. So we'll frequently get a box, and sometimes see those inscriptions. Occasionally, the books are coming to us because the person has died and it's part
Sure.
of an estate. But other times you can tell they just, for whatever reason, it was not as meaningful as it would seem like it should be.
Exactly, exactly. As is it limiting to call you a poet? Are you a writer? I mean, how would you define yourself?
I guess it depends on the context. I am an aspiring fiction writer as
Mm,
well. I have never published any fiction. It has yet to be seen if any of the novel drafts will come to any sort of
mm.
fruition, but I do write in other genres, and I do make visual art occasionally.
Oh, cool.
So, writer and visual artist is sometimes what I'll say,
Mhm.
although it feels funny to call myself a visual artist. I don't really have training in that area, but also I want to be someone who doesn't believe you have to have official training in something in order to claim a title. So I'll stick with it.
You talk about writing in different genres. What are your kind of reading habits? Are you reading just poetry? And then also maybe connected to that, like, are you reading like a student? Are you reading more analytically, or are you do you allow yourself to just be like, I'm just going to take this in. This is great work.
I feel like I'm always studying to some degree. I think that's a blessing and a curse of being someone who's actively writing pretty much all the time in some way, is that I can't fully detach from a book I'm reading and not be excited about the craft that's going on. And especially if I'm loving the book, I want to know, how is the writer accomplishing this if I can? And also studying it as a lover of literature too.
Right.
You know, we were talking about symbolism and stuff like that I still can get excited about. But I read just about everything. It's been interesting during this pandemic to notice its effects on my life as a reader. It seems like my mental faculties are getting like exhausted for months at a time. So I'll have a few months where I'm just reading voraciously, poetry collections a day, novels here, nonfiction book here. And then I'm in this stretch right now. And part of that is that I've come home and I'm in Birmingham and I'm dealing with a lot of, family stuff and whatnot. But I haven't had much capacity for reading. I've been reading like the same books kind of very slowly. I haven't been reading any poetry collections in weeks, which feels weird, but it's true. So I've been on a bit of a roller coaster with my reading, where I used to be much more consistently reading like a poetry book, a novel, and a nonfiction book kind of simultaneously all the time.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I wonder about kind of like the connection. So we talked about the childhood love of reading from the very beginning, and you were really supported in that, and then to now, New York, the New Yorker, and Louise Gluck is reading your work. Kind of some of the in between. Did you train? Did you go through MFA? And then maybe was there a moment or moments like a eureka where you were like, people like my stuff. Like I can do this for a living,
Well, this isn't that sort of eureka moment, but I just had this memory of, I was in elementary school and I was assigned to write something called a descriptive essay. I don't know if that's the sort of language that still gets used in
probably
public school
maybe
teaching
not
of
formally.
essays.
Maybe not formally, but I think we understand what that means. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's what I got. And I wrote something that involved a metaphor. And there was like a girl running so fast that her hair like turned into this comet. And I remember just feeling like, yeah, that was good. And I must have gotten some sort of praise for it from my teacher. And I think that's the first memory I have of being like, I'm good at writing, or this is something that I enjoy as opposed to just loving reading.
Sure.
So that's like a funny, very early moment. But I think those early moments can make a huge difference in a person's life. And, it just breaks my heart for kids who aren't getting that sort of encouragement early on or that acknowledgement early on. I was very lucky to have, this teacher who would say like, check mark, good job. This is great. But well, now I'm forgetting the first part. So, training.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I knew I wanted to study writing when I was an undergrad. So I was taking like a general creative writing major with some various minors. And I mentioned earlier, I didn't really know poetry existed until then. So I had to take a poetry class as part of that. And I was like, oh, poetry, like, that's fine. That's interesting. And then I was assigned this book, Crush by Richard Sykin, by a professor named Keitcha Kuipers, who's now a dear friend of mine. And that book just blew my mind. It was unlike any type of poem I'd ever read. It wasn't stuffy and formal and about the daffodils. It wasn't written in the 1800s. It was someone alive right now writing these really wild, weird, funny, violent, poems, and I was just in love.
Yeah.
So that made me feel like, oh, poetry might be something I actually want to write, because this is doing it for me. This is cool. But still, I I had this idea that poetry wasn't something you could build a life around. It wasn't serious. I was pretty obsessed with being, impressive and like having a career or something. And I thought like nonfiction is serious. Like nonfiction is something you can be proud to do. So I was very determined to try to be a nonfiction writer, although it wasn't my true passion or talent. So it came time to graduate from undergrad. I had this portfolio of some pretty strong, for my age and time, poems. And I had some pretty shitty nonfiction. And I was like, well, I know I want to get this thing called an MFA. I didn't know a ton about it, but I knew it was a few years where you were paid to read and write, which sounded like my heaven.
Yeah,
so I was like, I want to do that. I know I want to do that. And if I'm going to actually get into a program, I should probably use the writing sample that's decent.
Yes.
So I submitted with poetry. I was very fortunate to get into the University of Washington's MFA program in Seattle. And around that time, I just sort of had a, heart to heart with myself. And I was like, listen, like, you're a poet. I'm sorry, but that's like who you are. And yeah, it's time to stop acting like that's the second fiddle and just like really commit to this thing that you clearly love and that resonates for you and that you seem to have like somewhat of a skill set for. And so I kind of haven't looked back, even though I do write fiction on my own and explore other things. Like poetry is the thing that so much of my life orients around now. And I feel so lucky for that.
So from Alabama to Washington, maybe a huge change. I'm not sure. I guess it kind of goes into the question too about like, I mean, do you have a target audience? Has it been ascribed to you that you're a Southern writer? Is that welcome, not welcomed? Kind of who's your target audience? And then kind of what are some of the major themes or background of your writing, I guess? I don't know if that last part makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for the ways that Birmingham, Alabama, and Seattle, Washington, how they contrast and complement each other in my life. I feel like each place gives me something that the other one doesn't. So like together, they're like my perfect home. But I often feel like I need to go to the other to heal from the other one or to appreciate the other one.
Sure.
It's been really interesting just to feel, now that I've experienced both places for long enough. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for both of them for different reasons, and I'm frustrated with both of them for other reasons. And those reasons tend to be different sides of the coin. But shoot, I lost my train of thought. Remind me, give me a quick cue.
Just the idea of your target audience. Yeah. If audience is plural, possibly.
Yeah, I feel like my target audience would be anyone. Anyone to whom what I need to write could mean something. I am trying to write, what I need to write as honestly and rigorously as I can. And whoever needs that too, that's who I'm thrilled to be writing for. I have become more conscious of things like word choice and not wanting to feel like I'm only writing for people in academia or people who are going to be really impressed by, my super fancy word or knowledge of this very obscure thing. If that's the only reason I'm putting it in there, like if I'm genuinely super interested in this obscure thing that's 5 syllables long, like great, I'm not going to be afraid to use it, but I'm trying to question my impulses to go in that direction, so that, people like, the not literary members of my family, can read what I write and
Mm,
know what all the words mean, or at least be able to figure it out from context. So I'm questioning some elitist impulses in
mm,
me that I think are residual from trying to be a star student for so many years in my
sure.
youth.
Sure.
But otherwise, I'm just trying to write what I need to write, and hoping that if I share it widely enough, that it'll find the people who also need it.
Yeah. Is anything stand out or anybody stand out who maybe came up to you in the pre-pandemic days or emailed you or whatever that was kind of like a surprising fan of your work?
Oh, I love that question. I mean, it's always so surprising when someone I don't know at all
Hmm.
takes the time to reach out to me through my website or on social media, and say that something I wrote, one, found its way to them. That's
Sure.
miraculous.
It
And
is.
two, that it was meaningful. Um, there have been a few that have led to, something approximating friendships, which is really beautiful.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, they're all just, it makes my whole, face light up. I just like can't
Sure.
believe it every time. Yeah.
Yeah. So according to your podcast, which we'll maybe talk about in a bit, we will talk about in a little bit. I don't want to limit you, but you basically write dark, creepy poems about barnyard animals. Does that sound? I think that's what you were saying was like kind of like your stock answer to like, what do you write about?
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
how does that go over when you pull that out at parties and conversations?
I mean, it depends on, yeah, the type of people who are around, but it probably ends the conversation
Nice.
more often than not, or gives me the opportunity to turn the conversation in another direction that doesn't make me as squeamish.
There you go.
But that is very funny to hear that quoted back to me. But it's true. I mean, if you're looking at the vast majority of my work, like there's a lot of cows, there's a lot of
Uh,
goats, although they're dogs now. So I would say probably domesticated animals is
yeah.
generally an
Okay.
obsession. And a dark, creepy vibe is almost
Nice.
always there.
That's awesome. Do you,
Which might be the southerner in me a little bit, thinking about like Southern Gothic, the kinds of
okay.
literature that this region of the country is steeped in. There's
Hmm.
something about that like twisted gnarledness, that I think I'm drawn to, and feels true to me, and how I grew up.
Some of Faulkner's greatness, I guess, would be for someone who maybe didn't grow up in the South. I know that's I think more Mississippi.
Mhm.
He creates his own county, he creates his own world. Have you read any Faulkner, or is that kind of like everyone reads that, like that's kind of like cliche? And
No,
I wonder if it resonated with you at all.
yeah, I am a Faulkner novel fan for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sound and the Fury, just sort of like letting that just wash over me like
Hmm.
waves, was an extremely pleasurable and uncomfortable and
Right.
wonderful experience.
Right.
I wouldn't say I've like read all of his books, but
Mhm.
yeah, there's something in me that's excited by that style.
Mhm. Any writers that come to mind who you would consider to be Southern writers, like contemporary, who are really hitting it out of the park?
Oh my gosh. Well, it's funny because when I was first starting to study poetry, I felt very sort of unmoored and bereft because I didn't know of Southern poets,
Hmm.
like in terms of like traditional, canonized. Like I had the Faulkners and the Flannery O'Connors for fiction, but I
Sure.
was like, where are the poets? Like, do we
Mm.
not have any? But it's amazing how many contemporary Southern poets there are who are just incredible. I
Mm.
mean, Pulitzer Prize winner Jericho Brown,
Boom.
Pulitzer Prize winner Natasha Trethewey, um, Ricky Laurentis,
Okay.
from New Orleans.
Yeah.
Their poems are extraordinary. Um, I think Derek Austin is a Southern poet, technically. Tiana Clark,
Mm.
who spent a lot of her life in Nashville, Tennessee, and writes a
Okay.
lot about the South. Oh, just so many extraordinary poets
Mm-hmm.
coming out of the South right now. I feel just so lucky
Mm-hmm.
to be in this moment, um, in this constellation where these books are coming out all the time. So while I felt really sad to not have like a lot of like established literary history
Mm-hmm.
coming out for poetry in this region, it's really thrilling to get to be a part of the constellation of books that are coming out now.
Have you heard of the again, I don't know if she's just a Southern writer. Have you heard of Gabrielle Bates? She's really doing some big things, and
I don't know. I don't know.
maybe.
I'll look her up, but
Okay, yeah, yeah.
she sounds kind of, I don't know.
Pretty dang good. Pretty dang good. Man, I love language. I don't think that I'd ever seen the connection between canon and canonized. How you just said I was like, oh shoot. I think of, the
Mm.
Catholic in me thinks of, canonized as a saint.
Hmm.
Very cool, very cool. I will give you credit if I put that in one of my poems or something like that.
I love that. Please
Right.
do.
um Deciphering poetry, deciphering in quotes. Do you I think you were quoting Auden, I want to say, in one of your episodes you talked about the little a and the big A. I might have the wrong
Oh, I'm not
person.
sure. Yeah, I'm not sure who may have said that first.
I may be
I don't
mixing that
know.
up, but the idea of, the little a and the big A, like what is the poem about? It's about a trip to the grocery store. That's the little a, right? And then the big A, it's about, I'm using, I think, your example, abandonment. Do you do you, do you feel like it's troublesome to, like, for people who read your work or any work to, like, try to decipher it too much? Like, it's about this in a nutshell. What does, when you sit
Mm.
down to read slash write, are you thinking more about the little a or the big A, I guess?
I think the deciphering impulse is beautiful as long as it's coming from a spirit of discovery and pleasure and excitement, and not a feeling of self-consciousness or
Mm,
inadequacy or um, an assumption that a poem has a quote right answer,
okay, yeah.
that all poems are riddles, and if you solve it, you win the poem. Like
Mm.
I think it can be endlessly enjoyable to reread poems, searching for new layers, new meanings, new resonances with your own life. Um, but I think going to a poem, yeah, treating it like a riddle can be harmful because it
Hmm.
assumes that the poem has a right answer, and
Hmm.
it's not what it is, which is just an experience in language, and
Sure.
whatever it means to you is what the poem means, and what it means to you right now the first time you read it could be drastically different from what it
Mm.
means to you the 15th time you read it 10 years from now.
Hmm.
And knowing that a poem is alive in that way and is often intended to be experienced multiple times.
Right.
Maybe you read it the first time and it's really just all about hearing the music, and you're not really paying attention to what, if anything, is happening
Hmm.
in terms of the narrative that might be in the poem. And then maybe you read it again and you're really thinking about that narrative. And I don't know, I think there's so many different things you can put at the forefront of your attention when you're reading a poem,
Sure.
and they're all going to yield something new for you
Hmm.
and reward you more the more you think about it. So yeah, I'm always excited by, I don't know if deciphering is the right word or not, but maybe it is,
Hmm.
by just rigorous thinking in
Yeah.
relationship to any piece of art. I think is rewarding for the person who does it.
Sure. So I guess what kind of hearing you say is it's limiting, right? If you're looking for that right answer, you're limiting. I mean, you're saying the poem is almost endless in its possibilities, what it could mean for people.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
have a dear friend who's not a poet, um, not necessarily a literary type, and she was just texting me about my New Yorker poem because she saw it on Instagram or
Yeah.
something, and she was like, "I read it," and then she kind of wrote out like what she thought it meant, and she was like, "Is this right?" And I've told her, multiple times, I'm like, it's not about if it's right or not. Like, if that's what you got from it, that's amazing. And that's true. And that's what the poem means. But she always wants me to tell her, like, yes, you're right.
Nice. Yeah, I love the idea that you're talking about, the reread. The reread is crucial, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure that if you ever had a chance or will to like reread Zora Neale Hurston, you read it when you're, let's say, like fifth grade or something. Obviously, as a 15-year-old, 25-year-old, like it's going to give you something different, and that's great, right? That's to be celebrated,
Yeah. I
right?
do reread it every few years.
That's cool.
And it's amazing how it transports me back to my childhood and
Yeah.
that first experience of reading it, or those early experiences. And I get to experience it anew from my new perspective. So it's a fun sort of like double consciousness reading experience.
I love that. Experience it anew. Heck yeah.
Mhm.
Poetry comics. I don't know that I knew that was a thing. Is that kind of just intuitive? These are comics that are written in poetry form. Like you do poetry comics. That's one of the things that you're known for. You've done some exhibitions and such. How would you describe what those are?
Yeah, so the most simple way I usually describe it is, poetry comics are to poetry what graphic novels are to novels.
Okay.
So it's poetry where there's a visual art element involved. But in, a graphic novel where it's likely to have the narrative of the text playing out in the visuals, in poetry comics, there can be quite a bit of distance between the information the words are giving you and the information the visuals are giving you. So the contrast can be very weird, mysterious, surreal, in the ways that, if you're just reading a text-based poem, images can bounce around and be overlapping in ways that they couldn't in real life.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's really just poetry that also involves some original visual art, and they're interwoven in a way that, like, if you separated them, they would be very different pieces of art.
Do you go out of your way to like create that tension between the image and the text, or is that something that kind of comes up naturally? Like, is that like an objective of yours?
It's definitely something that excites me about it. I think discovery and experimentation is lost if I'm just sort of literally translating one thing to another. So that's part of the excitement of the form for me is, what is the visual that goes with this text, or what is the text that goes with this visual, and how can I make a spark between them? Or something that interests me.
Sure.
That I didn't expect. But I must be honest, I haven't been working in poetry comics for a while now. I have been doing some collaborations with other poets. So they provide the words and then I do the visual art for it. I have done some of those projects, but in terms of creating poetry comics myself, for whatever reason, I just haven't been drawn to making them in a while. And I'm hoping that inspiration or desire will come back at some point, because they do seem to be something I make that other people like to teach and like to talk about. And, I get invited occasionally to talk to classes about it. And I love doing that. Cool. But I'm starting to feel a little awkward doing it or like it feels almost dishonest because I'm not actively making them right now.
Sure.
But yeah, that's just an honest little blip.
Obviously, with all the work you've published, I mean, we're just going to get just a sampling, and it's kind of relatively arbitrary in some ways. Tried to pick some that were I think representative. I wonder if maybe we could get into either Win Her Second Horn or Little Lamb, or the more recent one. Maybe could have you read whatever you like, some of it, all of it, part of it, and then we can discuss a little bit.
Yeah. Well, are we just going to do one poem, or are we going to do multiple? Because that will affect probably what I choose.
Maybe we do Little Lamb and In the Circus.
Okay.
I'm sorry, not in the
Or
circus,
in
but
the
in the
dream.
dream. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, let me just give me a
Awesome.
second to pull up the
No
Little
problem.
Lamb poem. All right. Little Lamb. Daughter of sometimes, I can feel my ears slide to the top of my head, pelted against my will with the softest fur. Dumb, awful, awful, soft daughter wobbling around the long gone space of mother. Look, she is here now. On the other side of the roses and the vase, on the sill and beyond the window, a wall is being hammered. No, no, do not flinch. You are safe here in the house and mothered by every construction, every May lily rising. You know, you know, but what you say is knowing to a mind like mine, formed around the site of a blood drain in the floor. God bless her. Look at her go. God bless her. She is still searching for her trial by gentleness.
Thank you. One of my earlier questions I'd kind of forgotten about was just going to be about you and just performing your poetry versus, someone reading it on the page. And obviously you are a very good presenter. Um, the choice of columns and the format in that particular poem, I wonder how much of that you did on purpose and kind of what the point of the columns was.
Yeah, so for those who can't see it, the stanzas sort of go back and forth between being left justified and being indented over a little while. So
Mm-hmm.
they look like almost these little like clouds or hoof prints, you could say, going down the page back and forth. Um, I don't remember if it came out in this form originally or if this was a later move, but there was something in me that wanted to visually evoke the sort of back and forthness of the thought, the sort of two figures haunting this poem. So we have this daughter speaker and this mother, this absent sort of haunting mother figure. And so there are these dualities at play in the poem. And so it made sense to me to have sort of two different columns. And anytime I see a poem in columns or working a lot with caesuras, which is just a pause, a gap of white space in the middle of a line,
Okay.
it makes me think of estrangement, that there's some chasm between figures that can't be crossed for some reason, whether it's death, whether it's something else. And so all of this, for me is underlining a form like this. I wouldn't necessarily expect, people reading it to be able to say all of that. But if I'm just sort of spitballing about what it means to me, those are the sorts of things that come to mind.
Well, I like that. It's like a ping pong match or something like that. It's like, boom, your focus is here, right? This speaker, your focus is here, and the dualities. I appreciate that. That's really cool. I
Yeah, and I was writing this in, I think, the early days of the pandemic when I was just really feeling kind of trapped in my little apartment, and there was a lot of construction going on right outside, and it was this time of extreme sort of like stasis and held inness meets like some really jarring sounds and no escape from my interior monologue.
Yeah.
So that's just some background of like the context that I was writing in when I wrote this.
And I mean, wasn't Seattle one of the first like hard hit places too?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's
it
done a lot
was.
better, but I remember right off the bat, it was, oh man.
Mm-hmm.
Some of just the language. I mean, I love the awful, OFFAL, and awful. Like that's horrible. That's
Mm-hmm.
awful. The line
Mm-hmm.
about she's still searching for her trial by gentleness. That's just beautiful. Um, I think of lamb. I think of sacrifice. Being sacrificed. Maybe not having maybe more of a passive than an active thing. I wonder kind of some of the inspiration for the poem as a whole, or just the title, or both.
Yeah, so hovering in the vicinity of this poem is definitely William Blake's poem, Little Lamb Who Made Thee. Especially the strongest echo is in the God bless her, look at her go, God bless her. I forget how it goes in the Blake, but there's definitely an echo
Okay.
to him there in that moment. And I've just been thinking a lot across the course of writing my first book about ideas of innocence, and troubling that and thinking through the dangers of innocence and ideas of it. And also, when I was a kid, my mother bought this old building that was an old slaughterhouse.
Whoa.
And when I visited her, we would sleep there. And that space, the blood drains in the floor, the structure intended to slaughter
Jeez.
animals, being around me, it really captivated my imagination from an early age. And so while this poem isn't about that experience explicitly, I haven't found a way to write about that experience explicitly yet. That's where a lot of, these ideas and images are coming from too. I'm just like pulling that up from childhood and
Sure.
yeah, and just like knowing when you're a kid that violence exists and it's all around you, but not having the agency to really protect yourself from it, and just how scary that is. So yeah, so that's some of the things that are swirling around the orbit of this poem.
Well, keyword is yet. You have not written about that experience yet.
There's I must
rich
at some
fodder
point.
there.
I've tried. Yeah, I've tried in so many ways, but someday I will get it.
Wow. I'm also a big fan of the verb you use in there, mothered, as a verb is very, very cool there.
My dear friend Luther Hughes, who I do the Poet Salon podcast with, has inspired me to up my game with verbs, because he just blows me away with the verbs that he uses in his poems. So shout out to Luther for that.
Very cool. In the Dream in Which I'm a Widow is the the New Yorker, excuse me, poem of May 24th, 2021. I was wondering if you could bless us with a reading of that.
Yeah, I would love to. I made a recording of the poem to be published with the online version, but I would be thrilled to do a different one. Every time you read a poem, it feels a little different.
If you wouldn't mind, and again, it's your choice if you want to read just
no,
a little bit.
I would love to.
Yeah,
I recorded that one for them so long ago. This poem was accepted, gosh, in like fall of 2020, and so I've been waiting for this one to come out for a minute.
Oh man.
But yeah, I'd be thrilled to read it.
Thank you.
In the dream in which I am a widow, I have carried a portion of your ashes overseas to the Spanish statue of the falling angel, its snake of stone wrapped twice around one leg's ankle and coiled around the thigh of the other, stone jaw unhinged and reaching for the humanesque hand. We lived, remember, briefly near it. One wing arcs up in the sky, erecting an honest steeple, one that points not straight, but upward and curving, as faith goes, back to earth. I'd scattered part of what you were from the mouth of my black jacket sleeve onto the field across, watched over by tall and leaning trees, the field from which you returned to me so many nights, cold as ice and glowing, your socks full of grass. I heard the door open, blessed the opening, blessed the stench you brought inside our home, blood tangled in the hair on your shin, bits of another man's flesh in your cleats. I was curious about this forbidden felt language. I rubbed my thumbs into your muscles, the salt of you softening as it entered me. You were a wonder with your bones and skin on. You focused your violence with a pipette's precision, and it never spilled in my direction, never, though I lapped at its opening, determined to get a taste from the source. Years before we went north, before your bed was my bed, there was a garden in the south we snuck to, where spring made us a headboard out of heady jessamine. The poisonous vines scent sweet, aneurysmal sweet, swelling our brains against our skulls. I remember, even in that giddy upward state, I always knew truth was somewhere not in that sweetness. Now I've made of you a figure always falling. What sort of monster does this make me?
I tried to get the word wow out just now. I literally mouthed it. I literally just like a mime. I just wow. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you. You were a wonder with your bones and skin on. You I just lost the line there. We lived, remember? I love the short sentences in the middle. As faith goes back to earth. The very visceral things about the blood tangled in the hair, bits of another man's flesh. The before and after. Before your bed was my bed. I mean, what a beautiful elegy, really.
Mhm.
The
Yeah, I've been really interested in the form of the pre-elegy
mm.
lately, which says a lot about my brain. But this idea, and I first saw, I think, Natasha Trethewey do it at the beginning of her book. Shoot, it's my favorite book of hers. Why am I blanking on the name? But anyway, the poem I think is just called Elegy, but she's talking about writing an elegy for her father and how she's gathering information for it before he's dead. And just the idea of thinking about someone's death while they're still alive
Yes.
feels very true to how my brain works. I have a lot of sort of intrusive thoughts that feel like visions about the people I love dying, and poems are a way that I can do something with that, a really sort of painful imagery and feeling that does visit me. And so I have several of them at this point for various people in my lives. I'm not totally sure how they feel about that. I think they're honored and a little creeped out, but so this is one of those.
Oh my gosh. Is the book Thrall, Natasha?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the pre-elegy, I mean, you explained it, is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's eulogizing before someone has passed away. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing correctly. You said aneurysmal suite.
Yeah.
Is quite a turn of phrase. And that was followed with swelling our brains against our skulls. And that's a way of describing a happiness, right? A way of describing just almost like a euphoria.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that's beautifully done there. I am such a huge fan of ending a piece with a question. And you did that. And it's one of those where, it stays with you as you leave. Now I've made of you a figure always falling. What sort of monster does this make me? And it's like, I'm not a huge fan of multiple question marks, but it's like you would have like multiple question marks. Like it's just continuing that question just stays with the reader. And I even love the way that, I guess, the syntax of it, of figure always falling. I guess, it could be an always falling figure. but something about that just man, I would love to know, like, is that a poem that you read aloud a lot of times? Is that the type of poem that you need to hear before you're like, this is done?
I definitely did. That's usually a really important part of my revision process more than my drafting process.
Okay.
It really helps me hear when the momentum is sagging, where things feel clunky, where I could maybe cut. So I was definitely, mumbling it to myself at some point to get those sort of final cuts done. But in the first, in the drafting of it, no, I was just in the music of my silent head. But I do remember this being one of those poems that, one of those rare magical, thank, whatever God for them poems that it came out and I knew I had something. I was like, ooh, like this made me feel something. This is doing something that's interesting to me. I feel like I've articulated for the first time some aspects of my experience as a human being on this earth, for the first time. Like I got something out that I haven't been able to articulate before. And that feeling is probably more than anything what keeps me writing, is chasing that very rare, beautiful feeling. But I remember it with this poem. And so, I mean, one never knows what's going to happen with a poem in terms of like publication or how it's going to resonate with other people. But usually if I have that feeling about a poem in the drafting stage, it ends up being one that like places somewhere with like a good readership, and that people tend to like reach out to me about. And I'm learning to trust that intuition, that feeling more.
All right. Lightning in a bottle, huh?
I guess so. I wish I could make it happen at will, but
Sure.
I just have to keep showing up, and it always feels like it's going to be the last time.
Sell that formula. Was there one inspiration or multiple inspirations for the poem? Or maybe
I mean, beyond like an intrusive vision of the love of my life dying that I had while I was like out on a run.
Oh boy.
That was definitely an inspiration. But obviously, I mean, the statue is huge for me. The statue, it's in Retiro Park in Madrid.
Oh yeah.
And it's just a really affecting to me statue, on top of the fountain. And in the times when I've been very fortunate to live in Madrid for short stints of time, I would go for runs and almost always find my way to that statue at some point, and that would be like a turnaround point or something. And I really love sculpture generally. I see so many ekphrastic poems. Ekphrastic just meaning poetry engaging with some form of other art. I see so many of them engaging with paintings and photographs, but I don't see very many engaging with sculptures. And sculpture is a form of art that I'm really drawn to. So I'm glad I managed to get a sculpture in a poem, and I hope to do more of them.
Yeah. You talk about like comic poetry. I think we just inadvertently created one. When you were reading Little Lamb, I muted and I took a drink of water and I totally just spilled it over myself like a complete loser. So for those who are watching the YouTube, you can rewind, and there's something there in that contrast between her incredible work and me just dribbling water all over myself. So
It's my favorite thing ever. I'm so glad you told me, because I was deep reading and not looking at you, so I totally missed that moment.
And I said it after the fact. I didn't want to be like, oh, excuse me, while she's reading this great poem. Did you guys notice that? Oh man. Here's my transition. I think it works. You guys have a lot of fun on your podcast.
We do.
A lot of laughs, and some deep subject matter for sure. You bill it as a podcast where poets talk over drinks. Some really cool sound effects as well. I mean, you've had I don't even pronounce it, Danez Smith. I know his work. Incredible. Ross Gay, Lena Khalaf. Yeah, I was listening today to Maria Peñalosa,
Michelle Peñalosa.
Michelle
Hmm.
Peñalosa. I mean, all kinds of big time names, including yourselves, the three of you who host. How has that been as a kind of, I guess, an inspiration, a source of a fountain of inspiration for you? And what has podcasting been like for a writer?
It's been hugely inspirational to me. And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, just so much fun. The excuse to get together with these poets who I love as poets and as people
Mm-hmm.
and talk to, our heroes, basically, like whoever
Yeah.
we're reading, whose work we all love, having the excuse to reach out to them, and in
Hmm.
the non-pandemic times, inviting them over to my little apartment to sit around my table and drink a cocktail or a mocktail, or
Hmm.
if you're Henny Febderakib, a lukewarm Sprite, whatever they want. And oh, we've just had such fun, vulnerable,
Mm.
interesting, weird conversations. And oh, it's just been one of the biggest blessings of my life
Mm-hmm.
to make this with these beloved people. And in the beginning, especially, I was just so shocked that people would say yes. Like we don't have any institutional support. We
Mm.
are offering them nothing except a podcast conversation. And these are like some big names, like Ross Gay is a big deal. Like you have
Yes.
to go through a speaking agent, to even like
Uh-huh.
contact him.
Mm.
And the fact that he said yes was so exciting to us. Um, and I just have so many fond memories. I'm really looking forward, now that vaccinations are a thing, to being able to invite my podcast buddies back over
Very
and
cool.
give them giant hugs. We've been doing episodes over Zoom,
Mm.
and they've been great, but not the same.
Yeah, I bet. I bet. I bet.
It definitely changes the vibe. And part of what I loved so much about it was just being in a physical space with people and having a beverage and having the sunlight coming through the window and hitting us. So I'm really looking forward to being able to do that again in person.
So cool. Well, yeah, obviously it speaks to your the three of you and your talents as writers and podcasters that you keep getting these big guests because yeah, I mean you do great work. And the second part of the episode, right, is where the poet, he or she always chooses a does a person ever read some of his work, or is it always a favorite of his?
No, we always ask them to bring in a poem by someone else
Yes, okay.
other than them
Hmm.
for us to talk about. And it can be a longtime favorite poem of theirs. It can be one they've just been thinking about a lot lately. We get a huge mix, but it's always so fun. And I love that because it feels like what I wish academia felt like
Mm.
more. It's like a
Hmm.
rigorous engagement with a text, but it's also so driven by enthusiasm
Hmm.
and just like very earnest
Right.
love of poems.
Yeah.
And this speaks, I think, to what we were talking about earlier about, deciphering poems and what value that has, if any. And I think about how we could just keep talking about those poems for days if we wanted. I
Sure.
mean, you can get that sense in some of the
No
episodes
doubt.
that we're like having to stop because, other people are going to lose interest. But the more you think about a poem, especially in concert with other people, um, you can just go on and on and
Hmm.
on, looking at the formal choices that are being made, the conversation between the content of a poem and the form of a
Hmm.
poem, thinking about potential allusions or references or conversations outside of the poem. It's one of my favorite things to do ever.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's so great to have an excuse to do it regularly so that I schedule it into my life more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you talk about being earnest, like, I mean, what I really enjoy about your podcast is there's an intellectual curiosity for sure. And nobody has it figured out, right? Just in life in general. And you guys are asking questions, just saying, I don't get this. Like, it comes off as very genuine. It's obviously you have the training and you're all very good at what you do, but it's like, you don't trust people as much when they're like, I got it all figured out, right?
Yeah, I certainly don't.
You know?
And yeah, and we really want this podcast to be like friendly and fun for people, even if they don't know really anything about poetry and they just kind of are trying out this random podcast, or they have some interest in poetry, but they haven't studied it in school. So we are conscious of that audience, though sometimes we can go down some more academic roads in our thinking or our questions. I think particularly Duji, who has been in graduate school for poetry while we've been making this podcast. I think it makes sense that their questions would become more heady and academic, and that's great. I love a contrast. I love a mixture. We don't all want to be asking the sorts of like first questions about poetry the whole time. I love having a mix in there.
Yeah. Oh, definitely contrast. I mean, there are a lot of laughs, like I said, and one of the episodes that's fresh in my mind I listened to recently was with Michelle Peñalosa, and you talked about the Douglas Kearney piece. We were talking a little before we recorded. I was lucky enough to have him come and speak to my classes back in the day in LA, and it's the Tallahatchie, I believe, poem, and regarding Emmett Till, and I mean that one is heavy. And you could you could hear the silence in the room as you guys were asking questions and answering and kind of coming to realization. So there's something for everybody, no doubt. Poet Salon podcast, Google it / what's the best way to find you guys? Twitter, Instagram, all the above.
We're on Twitter,
Okay.
Poet Salon Pod. We have a website. I think it's thepoetsalon.com. And you should be able to find us wherever you listen to podcasts. So the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, other things.
Right, I know. What is next for you? You talk about some fiction that you're out there maybe querying and submitting. What's next?
Yeah, I'm trying to write a novel. We will see if it ever comes to fruition. And I'm feeling good about my first poetry collection. I feel like it's pretty done, but I'm starting to generate poems towards that second book. So it's fun to be sort of at that beginning, very exploratory phase with it. And so that's what I'm working on mostly in terms of my own creative work right now.
Very cool. Are you one that's able to keep those two ideas, and like, in other words, like in concert, are you doing just the poetry collection one day and just the novel one day? Or are they kind of concurrent?
It's pretty concurrent. When I get to control my schedule, it's been thrown off a little bit lately because of traveling back home, but typically my dream schedule is to wake up fairly early and spend the first few hours of every day on my own writing. And there will be stretches where it's working on fiction every morning. Poetry tends to happen whether I want it to or not. So I can do that more in quick snatches of time, anytime, in the afternoons, in the morning, at night. But those first morning hours, I try to keep sacred for my own work. I'm looking forward to getting back to that. Hopefully soon. Maybe when I get back to Seattle, I can have my hot novel writing summer.
There you go. Oh man, we're looking forward to your future work. It's just been such a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks so much for giving of your time.
Thank you so much, Pete. This has been really fun. I appreciate it.
Been such a cool conversation, and again, continued great luck with your work. I'll be sure to share all the links when the episode comes out, that they can read your New Yorker piece and check out the Poet Salon. And again, congratulations. It sounds like you're at the beginning of your hot poetry summer, and it's going to be a long one, right? It's going to be a long hot poetry summer. Might even go into the winter. Who knows? Who knows?
Who knows?
All right. Thank you so much for listening to episode 66 of the Chills at Will podcast with Gabrielle Bates. You can now subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Please leave a 5-star review. You can also ask for the Chills at Will podcast by name using Alexa. Find it on Spotify and on Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram, where I'm at Chills at Will podcast, or on Twitter, where I'm at Chills at Will PO1. That's the number 1. This is a passion project of mine, a DIY operation, and I'd love for your help in promoting what I'm convinced is a unique and spirited look in an often ignored art form. The intro song for the Chills of Will podcast is Wind Down instrumental. And the other great song played on the episode was Hoops instrumental by Matt Whitehour. Both songs are used through archesaudio.com. For now, thanks again for listening, and I hope that these quarantine days bring you texts by writers with mad skills like Gabrielle Bates, whose work gives you chills at